He was a strong man who believed he had complete authority until a black doctor took control of his daughter's life. What happens when the only person who can save your child is someone you've harshly judged? He didn't trust it. Will his prejudice cost him what he loves most in life? Or will he learn a lesson that transforms everything? Tell us where you're viewing or listening today in the comments section before we get started with this tale, and follow our channel for more videos like this one. For Jacob Fenton, the day had begun like any other. A wealthy and powerful guy, his corporate empire spanned multiple states, and he was accustomed to receiving what he wanted when he wanted it. And despite all the authority he held in the boardroom, he commanded a degree of respect that comes with decades of financial success. Mr. Fenton. The voice on the other end of the phone was steady, and nothing could have prepared him for the call that rocked his world. Because of an accident, your daughter Emily is in the hospital. His breath froze in his throat as time slowed. Emily, his only kid, was spoken as his mind raced to process the information. Without requesting specifics, the source of his happiness had been wounded. Jacob drove through the congested streets of New York in a luxurious SUV as he hurried to the hospital. The continual bustle of the city and the traffic vanished, to be replaced by a single idea. His daughter. He was met by a rush of medical personnel upon his arrival at the hospital. He was racing when the intense lights and antiseptic odor suddenly hit him. But his attention was fixed on Emily, so he stormed through the emergency room's automated doors. His thoughts were racing with anxiety until he noticed a nurse working at the front desk. His voice was sharp. "And I need to see my daughter Emily Fenton." "Where is she?" His reputation frequently preceded him due to a combination of desperation and command, and the most complied with his orders without inquiry, the nurse remaining composed in spite of his tone. "She is in room 412, Mr. Fenton, and the doctors are currently with her, according to her screen." Jacob turned on his heel and walked to the room, scarcely paying attention to the words, "doctors." As he went by stretchers, gurneys, and worried families, the hospital hallways appeared to be endlessly antiseptic. However, when he eventually arrived at room 412, it didn't matter because he longed to see his kid. His 16-year-old daughter, Emily, was so gorgeous and full of life that his heart almost stopped. On the bed, surrounded by a tangle of wires and tubes that connected her to machinery, she lay asleep and pale. The only confirmation that she was still with him was the cardiac monitor's constant bleep. As he approached, his breath came in sharp, agonizing gasps, and he felt helpless. A nurse was standing next to Emily, adjusting the IV drip for the first time in his life. Jacob's gaze then landed on the man at the foot of the bed, who had a white coat stethoscope around his neck, and was calmly and intently going over a chart. "My name is Dr. Samuel Green," the man remarked, reaching out to touch Jacob. But Jacob remained motionless, his eyes narrowing. He assessed the doctor in front of him, a tall, composed black man who spoke authoritatively. He had a surge of unease from the sight, which pulled at his ingrained biases. "I'm Emily's father," Jacob said, carrying this message with him for the whole of his life. His tone was icy, and he was staring at the doctor while disregarding the offered hand. "What happened to my daughter?" Dr. Green slowly lowered his hand. He remained professional throughout the occasion without appreciation. "Mr. Fenton, your daughter was in a car accident and has serious head injuries as well as internal trauma. We are keeping a tight eye on her." Jacob's stomach turned at the mention of a head injury, but the following 2 hours are crucial. You are the one treating her, and she is in critical trauma. "Yes," Dr. Green said in a composed and certain tone. "I am the primary physician supervising her care." Jacob's eyes flashed, "And I specialize in trauma instances like this one." He didn't repeat the words out loud, but they were ingrained in his memory with a mixture of incredulity and mistrust. The doctor seemed to detect Jacob's uneasiness. "But is there anyone else?" But he went on unmoved. "We've already done preliminary scans, and while we're trying to stabilize her condition, we'll need to keep an eye out for any indications of brain swelling." Jacob reiterated that it is essential that we move swiftly and precisely. His voice rose. "You're discussing my daughter's life here, and I want her to get the best care possible." Do you realize that Dr. Green steadily met his gaze? That's precisely what I'm going to offer. Jacob and Mr. Fenton were unable to get rid of the underlying distrust and rage. His feelings were a tornado of terror, and it was simpler to focus them on the man standing in front of him, who didn't meet Jacob's strict standards for what a doctor ought to be. This was an unpleasant, unsaid reality. Despite being hidden beneath layers of privilege and ignorance, it was still present. The fact that a black doctor was managing his daughter's life went against all prejudices. I'm going to need a second opinion, Jacob remarked sharply, although he had never thought to ask. I won't take any chances with my daughter. Dr. Green's expression remained unchanged. He had previously dealt with men like Jacob whose riches and prestige protected them from their own prejudices. You are welcome to look for one, Mr. Fenton, but there is not much time. Jacob's eyes were burning with annoyance, so I suggested that we concentrate on your daughter's care for the time being. However, a nurse interrupted him before he could reply by entering the room. The most recent vitals for Dr. Emily are ready. Dr. Green nodded and looked at the records. Standing motionless by his daughter's side, Jacob's feelings were a poisonous mixture of fear, rage, and something more he didn't want to mention. He had always taken great satisfaction in choosing courses of action that would keep his family safe, but this was beyond his control. As Jacob sat by Emily's bed and observed her chest rise and fall, the hours passed slowly. Nurses came and went, adjusting meds and taking notes in time with the machines. However, Dr. Green was always there, keeping an eye on every facet of her health. Jacob's mind raced, fighting with himself with steady precision. On the one hand, his paternal instincts begged him to take every necessary action to save his daughter, even if it meant having faith in this physician. Yet, his judgment was impaired by his deep-rooted biases. He glanced at Dr. Green once again, and as he saw the man move with peaceful assurance, he became uneasy at how calm the doctor seemed, how indifferent he appeared to be to the circumstances, as if he didn't realize how serious everything was, or did he simply not care? Jacob's annoyance grew. His fingers ached to phone someone who matched his ideal of a legitimate doctor because he needed answers, to exert pressure and insist on a replacement. But Emily's health was too precarious. Jacob was aware that time was not on his side despite everything, as the minutes turned into hours. Jacob continued to sit next to Emily's bed, his thoughts racing with each machine sound. Since the accident, he had hardly left her side, and all of his energy was directed toward just one thing: her survival. But as he tried to make sense of the situation, the pressure of his thoughts increased. Control was the foundation of Jacob's existence. He had authority over his businesses, relationships, and future. But now that he was sitting in this sterile room, he had no control over the decisions. And that bothered him, particularly since the person making those judgments was someone he had previously assessed. For reasons he didn't fully comprehend but could sense in his gut, he couldn't trust. Jacob didn't have the energy to deal with the outside world, so he disregarded his phone buzzing in his pocket. Emily was the most important person in the world. His kingdom could wait, and she had been everything to him. He had dedicated his entire being to raising Emily alone since her mother died when she was just 10 years old, giving her a luxurious lifestyle that includes private education, international holidays, and a prosperous future in which he couldn't let her go. But his daydream was cut short by a gentle pounding on the door. As a familiar person walked into the room, Jacob looked up. "Jacob," the man whispered quietly. Charles Reed. Charles, his business partner, had hurried over with a sympathetic tone in his words. His face was filled with worry as he stood in the doorway after learning of the accident. Jacob ran a hand through his graying hair and exhaled a long, tremulous breath, asking, "How is she?" "She's hanging on," he whispered softly, his voice rasping with fatigue. "But I'm not sure." Charles moved deeper into the room and put a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder, saying, "I don't know if she's going to pull through." He was tall, had silver hair, and shook hands firmly, as if he had been negotiating for years. After decades of building their commercial empire together, Charles and Jacob had a strong tie that couldn't be broken. Charles whispered, "She's strong," as he looked at Emily's motionless body on the bed. I'm not sure if Jacob swallowed the doctor hard, but she'll get through this. I don't trust this Dr. Green, even if he claims to be doing everything in his power." Charles arched an eyebrow, saying, "You don't trust him? I need to get someone else in here." Jacob paused, unable to fully put his thoughts into words because they were lodged in his throat, not in a manner that would not portray him as the man he truly was. Charles gave him a long look and said, "I don't feel comfortable with him ling Emily's care." "Jacob, you're talking about your daughter's life here?" His brow was furrowed in perplexity. Jacob shook his head. "I'm not implying that he lacks qualifications. But if this doctor is doing everything in his power, that's what counts." However, Charles's tone was stern but patient as he asked, "What's bothering you, Jacob?" He clenched his jaw. "You have the best doctors in this hospital working on her case." He knew what was upsetting him, but how could he express it aloud? His eyes hardened. How could he acknowledge that based only on the color of his skin, he didn't trust Dr. Green? That long-standing, deeply ingrained prejudice has never before manifested itself so obviously. However, it was there without a doubt, and I don't want to take any chances. To avoid answering the question, Jacob murmured, "I'm going to find someone else." Instead of answering right away, Charles read the strain in Jacob's face. He spoke carefully, expressing his dread, and something else he hadn't anticipated seeing in Jacob. "You may be making a mistake if you're choosing this doctor based more on his personality than his actions." "I'm not being crazy," Jacob yelled. "But you should concentrate on Emily's care." His voice rose, and the long simmering rage finally erupted. "This is my daughter," he said. Charles stated equally, "I have the right to make sure she's in the best hands, of course you do." Not responding to the provocation, "But you should consider whether you're certain you're not allowing your own." When Jacob used the word bias in this context, it felt like a slap in the face, and that made him defensive, because he had never thought of himself as a biased person. He had always taken pride in being fair, and he employed hundreds of people from many backgrounds, at least not publicly. But here he was, doubting a doctor's ability based just on his race. His thoughts were racing with the conflict. Was Charles correct, or was he being unfair? However, another voice inside of him claimed that this was his daughter. The tension between them lingered for a while, and he had every right to demand perfection. Charles finally let out a sigh and moved away, saying, "I know you're afraid, Jacob. We all are. But if you choose to see another doctor, I believe you should have faith in the professionals who are here to help your kid." Jacob didn't respond, his mouth still clamped tightly. "But don't let this be about anything other than what's best for her." Charles nodded slightly and walked out of the room, leaving Jacob alone himself once more. As the hours passed slowly, he thought of Dr. Green. In a fit of rage and terror, Jacob started to pace the hospital corridors. He was accustomed to being the guy in charge, but Emily's condition remained dire, and he felt helpless. However, now that his daughter's life was at stake, all of his typical shields appeared to break down. As he walked past doctors, nurses, and patients, his thoughts were racing with potential outcomes. How could he have allowed someone he didn't know to have such faith in him, putting his daughter's life in the hands of someone he didn't completely trust? Dr. Green was carefully reviewing Emily's charts in her room when he eventually made it back. As Jacob walked in, the doctor looked up and gave him a quick nod before going back to work. Jacob inquired in a nervous voice, "How is she?" Dr. Green paused while putting the chart down. "Although she's okay for now, we're still keeping a careful eye on her in case anything changes. Though it's too soon to know, I'm hopeful that Jacob experienced the words. However, they simply seemed to increase his anxiousness rather than provide the respite he had hoped for. It nearly didn't seem real as he tightly crossed his arms and gazed at his daughter's pale face and body. After a minute, Mr. Fenton Dr. Green spoke in a calm tone. "Although I understand that you are going through a tough moment, I want to reassure you that we are doing everything in our power to support Emily." Jacob clenched his jaw, wanting to believe him, but the doubt kept bugging him. His eyes were piercing as he turned to face the doctor. "I don't doubt your knowledge." He started speaking slowly and deliberately, "Doctor. Although I'm wondering if perhaps we should have another viewpoint on this. Dr. Green looked him in the eye evenly. "I understand your concern," he continued quietly, his face impassive. "You're her father, and it's normal to want to provide her the finest care possible, but I think that her recuperation should come first for the time being." Jacob's mind was racing, but he didn't answer. The tone was once more cool and collected. It appeared to contradict all he experienced. How did Dr. Green maintain such composure? When it seemed like everything was falling apart, he was so confident in himself, but before Jacob could say anything more, when one of the equipment abruptly beeped, both men turned to view the monitor, and Dr. Green's expression instantly changed from serene. He said, "To concentrate, her oxygen levels are decreasing." He hurried to the patient's bedside and called for the nurse. Jacob felt a wave of panic as he saw the medical staff go into action. Everything seemed to proceed quickly, with Dr. Green giving precise orders and the nurses adjusting the devices. And Jacob stood motionless, unable to do anything but observe as she started. However, as he saw the numbers on the monitor change, his heart raced and his voice stuck in his throat. He became acutely aware of how far out of his depth he was for the first time. Here, he had absolutely no control, and Jacob observed as the medical staff hurried around Emily's bed. She was immobile. The heart monitor's beeping had changed to a fast, unnerving pace, and Dr. Green's serene. However, an urgent voice gave the nurses instructions, and every word was measured and purposeful. "Her oxygen levels are erratic. Therefore, Dr. Green asked her to increase the supply of oxygen." As he glanced at the monitor, the nurses quickly adjusted the cables and tubes. Jacob stood motionless in the corner, his thoughts a haze of bewilderment and terror. Jacob felt completely helpless for the first time in his life since this was his daughter. Here he was, the one person in the world he had promised to defend at all costs, diminished to a spectator who could only observe as others struggled to save her. The minutes dragged on agonizingly, with every second being filled with the droning sound of machinery, and the medical staff's quiet, focused urgency, as well as the observation of Dr. Green's precise movements, keeping the mayhem under control with an unsettling serenity only, made Jacob's stomach churn. But even though Jacob wanted to snap and blame someone for this scary time, his dread and rage were all twisted inside of him, and he was unable to control them. However, it was an indisputable fact that Emily's destiny lay with the man he didn't trust. Jacob released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding until the crisis was over and the machine stabilized. "We've stabilized her," Dr. Green remarked, wiping his brow and turning to face him with a stern yet composed expression. His voice remained firm. "But I'm going to conduct additional tests because we're not quite out of the woods. We must keep an eye on every development to make sure her brain isn't swollen at the moment." Jacob nodded, wanting to say something, but his throat was too thick. Anything. But instead of speaking, he observed as Dr. Green walked out of the room. He dropped onto the chair next to Emily's bed, the tension still palpable. The sight of his daughter looking so frail and pale made his hands tremble a little. He was so dependent on the machinery that kept her alive that he couldn't bear to lose her. Jacob sat in silence for a while, his thoughts spinning, everything seeming unreal. His gaze kept wandering to the door like a nightmare he couldn't get out of. The room was silent, despite half expecting Dr. Green to come with more terrible news. Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by the machine's steady beeping as the minutes went by. As he thought back to his earlier exchange with Charles, the word bias kept coming to mind, and the awkward reality that he had been avoiding for so long started to clamber to the surface. Was he indeed endangering his daughter's life by allowing his own bias to cloud his judgment? Because of this, he had always considered himself to be a rational man who evaluated others according to their skills, not their skin tone, but they are suddenly confronted with this circumstance. He was unable to deny that his mistrust of Dr. Green was unrelated to the man's medical knowledge. Given everything related to his identity, the insight came as a shock to Jacob. He had lived his whole life in a world where he was protected from unpleasant realities by his money and privilege. However, he was unable to hide from them any longer while he was sitting in this hospital room. When Jacob awoke the next morning, he heard soft whispers coming from outside Emily's room. He didn't intend to go to sleep, But at some point throughout the night, fatigue took over. He looked at the clock and blinked blearily. It was just after 6 o'clock. Dr. Green was standing close to the entrance, whispering to one of the nurses. He seemed as composed as ever, but there was a glimmer of fatigue in his eyes. As Dr. Green walked over, Jacob sat up straight in his chair and inquired, "How is she?" Dr. Green looked at the chart in his palm, his speech scarcely audible above a whisper. According to him, Emily's oxygen levels have increased, and her health is currently stable. And although we're seeing some encouraging indicators, we still need to keep a tight eye on her because she's still in risk. Jacob nodded, feeling a mix of relief and concern about any other issues. And the testing? What about the swelling? This morning, we're doing a CT scan to look for any indicating swelling. When we learn additional information for the first time since Emily's hospital admission, I'll let you know. A little timid glimmer of optimism flickered through Jacob's mind. However, when he glanced at Dr. Green, the mistrust briefly surfaced. That had infused each of their exchanges appeared to wane. Jacob paused, then said, "Dr. Green," starting off slowly, "I acknowledge that I've been difficult to deal with and that I've allowed my own biases influence how I perceive you." The words were difficult for him to say. However, things had to be said. "I just wanted to let you know how much I value everything you've done for Emily." After a moment of staring at him with an unreadable expression, Dr. Green nodded slightly. He murmured softly, "Thank you, Mr. Fenton. I know this is a tough time for you. I just want to make sure your daughter gets the greatest care possible." Jacob nodded, a knot forming in his throat. He had so much more to say about how foolish he had been, and how he had allowed his own stupidity to blind him. Yet, it didn't seem like enough. Instead, he just added, "I trust you." Despite being a straightforward phrase, it conveyed a significant change. Jacob was finally starting to overcome his fear and prejudice for the first time since Emily's injury. Whatever had impaired his judgment, he was beginning to recognize Dr. Green for the expert that he was, a kind physician who was making every effort to save his daughter's life. Jacob stayed by Emily's side as the hours flew by in a haze of anxiety and anticipation, observing as the staff made medication adjustments and checked her vitals. Dr. Green was always composed and focused. Around them, the hospital's routine buzzed on. But Jacob was absorbed in his own world, one in which Emily's precarious health was the primary consideration, and by late afternoon, the CT scan results were in. Despite appearing calm, Dr. Green's face had a small stiffness when he first entered the room that Jacob was unable to disregard, and we have seen the images, Dr. Green stated. "There is some swelling in her brain, but it's not as bad as we thought." His voice is firm yet serious. "However, it remains a problem, and we will need to move quickly to alleviate the burden." "What does that imply, surgery?" Jacob's heart fell. Dr. Green nodded. "Although it's a delicate technique, it's essential to make sure the swelling doesn't worsen the situation." Surgery was what Jacob had feared most, and his thoughts were racing. He slipped the question out before he could stop himself. "And you're going to perform it?" "Yes," Dr. Green said, evenly addressing Jacob's gaze. "I'll be in charge of the surgical team. I'm certain that this is the best course of action for Emily because I've done it numerous times." The idea of his daughter having surgery sent a shockwave through Jacob. Although having surgery was always a scary experience, the knowledge that he had to trust someone he had previously rejected based only on skin color for the first time in his life. He forced himself to ignore his worry by taking a big breath. This was no longer about him. It concerned Emily, and whether or not she had the best chance of surviving under Dr. Green's care. Then Jacob would have to trust him to do whatever Jacob said in a calm voice. But with a silent resolve in his gaze, Dr. Green nodded, his eyes heavy with the weight of his choice to save my daughter. "The hospital waiting room's immaculate walls promise that we'll take good care of her, Mr. Fenton," appeared to enclose Jacob as he sat with his hands firmly clutched in his lap. In his head, the wall clock ticked away noisily, each second seeming to drag on forever. For the first time in his life, Emily was undergoing surgery while under the care of Dr. Green. Jacob had to give up authority in order to entrust the most significant aspect of his life to another person. Other families sat in silent agony across the room, and he had never felt so powerless. Jacob could sense their tension as they waited for updates on their loved ones. However, his own anxiety was too overwhelming for him to connect with them. Worst-case scenarios rushed through his head, and the prospect of losing Emily tormented him. He had been told by a nurse that the procedure would take several hours, and that he should wait in the assigned region. But how could he do nothing when his daughter's life was in jeopardy? He pulled out his phone to check his emails and messages in an attempt to divert his attention. Everything to distract him from the oppressive fear. But every effort felt ineffective. Right now, his business, riches, and status were all irrelevant. Emily. Jacob closed his eyes and leaned back in the rigid chair. And that was all that mattered. He mentally relived the last few days, his thoughts returning to Dr. Green. He never thought he would be in this situation, having to face his own prejudices. How? Had he allowed it to get this far while his daughter lay on the surgery? How had he let his own ignorance prevent him from seeing what was really important? Jacob had dedicated his life to erecting walls of privilege, riches, and power that had kept him from facing hard realities. Because bias was rarely questioned in his environment, he had never had to face it. However, those barriers were suddenly coming down, exposing him to the unpleasant reality of who he was. Despite Jacob's mistrust, Dr. Green had never once expressed rage or displeasure. He had maintained his composure and professionalism while concentrating on Emily's life's most important priorities. Jacob was learning this lesson far too late, but it was now unavoidable. Jacob's heart leaped in his chest as the waiting room door cracked open and a nurse entered. "Mr. Fenton," she replied softly, her face neutral but determined. Although the procedure is still ongoing, Dr. Green wanted me to let you know that thus far, everything is going well. "Thank you," Jacob replied, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The nurse nodded reassuringly before exiting the room, his voice barely above a whisper. For a minute, Jacob sensed a glimmer of optimism as the door quietly closed behind her. However, it was soon eclipsed by the uncertainty of what lay ahead, and time seemed to lose all significance. Jacob's thoughts drifted back to his childhood memories of Emily while he waited for news. He recalled her stumbling down the driveway with a determined expression on her face the first time she rode a bike. He had been so proud of her and confident that she would become a strong, self-reliant adult. But despite everything he had planned for her future, neither his wealth nor his connections could shield her from this. Her happiness, career, and education were all on the line, and the man who now controlled her destiny was the one he had previously rejected. Jacob recalled the conversations he had had with Dr. Green prior to the procedure. He had remained serene and self-assured, believing that he could save Emily's life. It was a confidence that Jacob mistook for indifference out of fear and prejudice. But now that he was by himself in this waiting area, Jacob could see that Dr. Green wasn't apathetic. He was determined to help Emily, and he was doing everything he could, just like Jacob had always done. The difference was that Dr. Green had the abilities to defend her, the skills and expertise to save her in a manner that Jacob was never able to. The idea made Jacob's lips turn bitter because he had dedicated so much of his life to being the guardian, the supplier, but he was now helpless and had to rely on the man he had mistrusted, and Emily had a chance because of that man. Jacob's ideas were the sound of the waiting room door opening again, this time revealing Dr. Green, cut off the conversation. Despite his white coat being a little wrinkled after the hours spent in surgery, he had a serene look. He said softly, "Mr. Fenton, you're steady and reassuring." Jacob's heart appeared to stop for a second after the successful surgery. Dr. Green nodded, a tiny smile pulling at the edges of his mouth, and assured her that everything would be all right. "Yes, we were successful in reducing the pressure in her brain, and she is now stable, albeit she will require time to heal." However, the prognosis is favorable, and Jacob experienced a surge of relief. He had been hanging on to so much fear, and it was so strong that it almost brought him to his knees. He stood there looking at Dr. Green with so much uncertainty that the news seemed nearly unbelievable. Unable, To find the right words to express gratitude, he eventually managed to speak in an emotionally charged voice. Dr. Green nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for saving my daughter. That's why we're here, Mr. Fenton. Emily is a resilient young lady who has a fair chance of recovering completely." It was the first time in years that Jacob had permitted his eyes to brim up with tears. He had always held the view that the secret to success was strength, which meant keeping everything under control. However, he now understood that true strength comes from something else. From putting his confidence in other people, from letting go of things that didn't matter, and from confronting his own hard truths. "I owe you an apology," Dr. Green, Jacob said, his voice faltering. "Before even giving you a chance, I made a snap judgment based on my own ignorance, and I apologize for that." Dr. Green's face softened. "I am aware, Mr. Fenton, that these circumstances elicit strong feelings in people. The important thing is that your daughter is safe and will be all right." Jacob swallowed hard and continued to nod. "I need you to know that I was mistaken and that Dr. Green now smiled kindly. "Thank you. I'm grateful. But Emily's recovery is what matters most at this time." Jacob nodded as he realized that his apology would not be sufficient to make up for his faults. However, it was a beginning, and Jacob had clarity for the first time in a long time. Emily's condition gradually improved in the days after the surgery, and the swelling in her brain decreased. As she gradually started to regain consciousness, Jacob was by her side the entire time, observing her with silent appreciation and humility each and every time. When Dr. Green came in to see how she was doing, Jacob was filled with both admiration and respect for the man who had before had such a strong skepticism of Dr. Green's knowledge and empathy, and Emily's life had been spared by his persistent commitment to her care, which also made Jacob face the ugly. Admitting that he had been mistaken was difficult for him to do on his own, the reality that he had allowed his personal prejudices to influence his decisions. But as he observed Emily gradually regaining her vigor. Although change was difficult, Jacob understood that he couldn't carry on living his life as he had previously. One afternoon, Jacob got up from his chair as Dr. Green completed taking Emily's vital signs. "I know I've said this before, but I just want to say it again," remarked Dr. Green quietly. "Thank you. You have altered my life in addition to saving my daughter's." After giving him a brief glance, Dr. Green nodded. "It has been an honor to assist Mr. Fenton, and I'm happy to see Emily doing so well. She is a fighter, just like her mother was." And Jacob grinned, feeling at ease for the first time in days. Dr. Green's face softened, "And I'm confident she'll fully recover." Jacob took a seat next to Emily's bed and watched her sleep soundly as Dr. Green left the room. He was aware that recuperation would take time and that there were still obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, in addition to feeling hopeful, Jacob felt transformed. The next few days were a haze of cautious hope that Emily was getting better. Her consciousness returned in soft waves as her body gradually recovered strength. Jacob was by her side almost all the time he was awake, and every little triumph made his pulse race. The first few words she uttered in a hoarse voice, the first time she opened her eyes, the first time she grasped his hand. His voice was firm but shaky, and all of it gave him optimism that he hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Her eyes flickered awake as she looked at him. What had happened? Jacob forced himself to suppress his feelings. As he leaned closer, there was a mix of relief and worry. "You were in an accident, my love. However, the physicians have taken fantastic care of you, so you will be okay." Emily's forehead furrowed slightly as she blinked, seemingly attempting to piece together the pieces of memory. "I only recall the automobile and nothing else." Gently removing a lock of hair from her forehead, Jacob grinned and said, "Don't worry about that now." Emily gave a feeble nod, "But the most important thing is that you're here and getting well." Jacob observed her for a while until her eyelids began to drift shut once more due to tiredness. His heart was full of thankfulness, and moreover, a silent sense of humility. He had devoted a significant portion of his life to dominating others and being the man with all the answers. However, he now realized that some things were out of his control, and that was acceptable. Dr. Green was a constant presence, checking up on Emily every day while she recovered. After providing her with progress reports every time he walked into the room, Jacob's respect for her was restored. Dr. Green's medical knowledge was not the only thing that impressed Jacob, the man who had saved his daughter's life. It was his serene, unwavering compassion and his capacity to look past appearances and concentrate on the important things. Emily was not treated as a case by Dr. Green, but personally, and in doing so, he had made Jacob face his prejudices, that 2 weeks after the surgery had impairing his own judgment for much too long. Emily was able to be transferred from the intensive care unit to a standard hospital room since she was strong enough. Jacob trailed closely behind the nurses as they wheeled her bed down the hall, grinning. Seeing how far she had come and how much lighter the new space was made, his heart swelled with pride. Emily grinned feebly as she got comfortable in bed, surrounded by natural light from a wide window that looked out over the city. She whispered, as her gaze strayed to the window to take in the view. Jacob stood next to her, his hand resting on the bed railing. And it's lovely. His voice was full with passion as he said, "It's not as beautiful as seeing you get better." Emily smiled gently at him, her eyes sparkling with tears that had not yet been shed. Dad Jacob's throat constricted. He had always supported her. Thank you for sticking with me. At least he had believed so. But now that the hospital room is quiet, he understood that his presence went beyond only ensuring she had the greatest education possible, or the most cozy living. It was about something more profound that he had nearly overlooked. He was thankful to both Dr. Green and himself, since he had almost let his own ignorance to overshadow what really mattered. But to Emily for allowing him to recover later that day while she took a nap. For a few minutes, Jacob paced back and forth in the corridor to stretch his legs. His mind kept going back to Dr. Green as he relived everything that had transpired, to how, seemingly at the right moment, the doctor handled everything with such expertise and grace. With a clipboard in hand, Dr. Green emerged at the end of the hallway and approached him. He nodded to Jacob as he went up to Mr. Fenton, and Dr. Green said, "He spoke calmly as usual, and I was just stopping over to see how Emily was doing." "She's doing great," Jacob answered, grinning slightly. "Thanks to you, I feel better every day." "I'm happy to hear that she's made remarkable progress," said Dr. Green modestly, "and I'm sure she'll keep getting better." They were silent for a moment before Jacob inhaled deeply. Dr. Green decided it was time to finally address the issue at hand. Jacob started out slowly, "And I've been reflecting a lot on the events of the last few weeks, and I just wanted to apologize for my actions, as well as for judging you without even realizing it." "I was mistaken," Jacob said, as Dr. Green gave him a neutral yet attentive glance. His tone was steady yet genuine, and I allowed my own biases to overshadow what was truly important. Emily's health. And you disproved me in every manner by saving her life. Dr. Green looked at him for a time and then smiled quietly, and for that I will always be grateful. "Mr. Fenton, whether we are aware of it or not, everyone has prejudices. What counts is that you have acknowledged yours, and that, although it's not always simple, you're prepared to learn from this experience." Jacob nodded, his shoulders feeling lighter. "I'm trying, and I hope that this will help me become a better person, not just for Emily, but also for myself." This time Jacob didn't hesitate when Dr. Green held out his hand. As the weeks stretched into months, he gave the doctor a solid handshake, a move that seemed more significant than words could express. Emily recovered completely, regaining her strength every day. Jacob proudly observed her return to life, her spirit unaffected by the torture she had endured. Jacob viewed her with fresh eyes, yet she was still the same vivacious, driven young lady she had always been. He had changed in unexpected ways as a result of the hospital experience. It wasn't simply about learning to trust others. It involved facing the more sinister aspects of himself that he had never wished to admit. He had to confront the unsettling reality that he had almost lost because of his own prejudices. The most valuable item in his life, but that insight also presented a chance for development, for change, and Jacob was not about to let that chance pass him by. After Emily was discharged, He contacted Dr. Green to thank him and extend an invitation to lunch. At a peaceful cafe, the two guys sat down and talked about their experiences, families, and lives. Before what happened in the hospital, Jacob could never have imagined having that talk. However, as they parted ways, Jacob, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, discovered that he had made a new friend in addition to gaining a fresh viewpoint. Dr. Green's patience, compassion, and quiet strength had made a lasting impression on Jacob's life. Many months later, when Jacob and Emily strolled through Central Park, he would always be thankful for that. He felt a sense of calm that had escaped him for so long as he watched her laugh and joke with friends. A fresh sense of direction and clarity had taken the place of the burden of the previous few months. He was granted another chance, not only with Emily but also with himself. Emily looked up at her father as they walked through the park, and he wasn't going to waste it. She smiles and says, "You okay, Dad? You seem quiet." "I'm okay," Jacob answered quietly, grinning back and nodding. "Just reflecting on how fortunate I am to have you." Emily rolled her eyes and laughed. "I suppose you're quite fortunate." Jacob laughed, his heart bursting with appreciation and affection. "More than you realize, my love." And they carried on strolling alongside each other after that. The bright, hopeful future that lies ahead of them is free from the shadows of the past.